In 1945, thousands of men were freed from Nazi concentration camps. But for many of them, liberation never came. They returned home to find themselves still treated as criminals, not by the Nazis, but by their own country. This is the story of how a regime's hatred was replaced by something equally destructive: silence. May 1945. Berlin is in ruins. Allied soldiers move through the streets, freeing prisoners from camps across Germany. Among them are men wearing something no one wanted to talk about: pink triangles sewn into their uniforms. These triangles weren't random. They were a system, a legal code, a choice made by an entire nation to mark certain men as less than human. But here's the thing nobody expected. Many of these men survived. They lived through horrors that should have killed them. They endured cold that froze fingers black, forced labor that broke bones, medical experiments that destroyed bodies. And when the camps finally opened their gates, these survivors thought the nightmare was over. It wasn't. In fact, something worse was waiting for them outside those prison walls. The law that sent them to the camps didn't disappear with the Nazi regime. It stayed, and it would haunt them for decades. To understand what was destroyed, you need to see what existed first. Go back to 1920s Berlin, the Weimar Republic, a city unlike anything the world had ever seen. In the cabarets and bars tucked into basement corners, a community was thriving. Men openly gathered with other men. There were newspapers written for them, clubs designed for them, a life that, for the first time in German history, didn't have to be completely hidden. On the surface, paragraph 175 still existed. This was the old law, created back in 1871, that made sexual relations between men illegal. But in the Weimar years, something shifted. Nobody was aggressively enforcing it anymore. This freedom wouldn't last, and the Nazis knew exactly why they wanted to destroy it. In 1919, a man named Magnus Hirschfeld opened something revolutionary: the Institute for Sexual Science. It wasn't just a building, it was a statement. Hirschfeld was a doctor, a researcher, and he was saying something radical for his time. Homosexuality was not a disease. It wasn't a crime. It was simply human variation. The Institute became a beacon. Scientists from across Europe came to study there. Reformers used its research to argue that paragraph 175 should be removed entirely. Publications like Der Freund and Die Freundin circulated across Germany. Openly gay newspapers that built networks, shared stories, created community. For the first time in modern history, gay men in Germany could imagine a different future. They could see themselves not as criminals hiding in shadows, but as people worthy of rights. The Nazis saw this freedom as everything wrong with Germany, and they were preparing to erase it completely. January 30th, 1933, 11:15 a.m. Adolf Hitler is appointed Chancellor of Germany by President Hindenburg. By evening, torchlit processions march through Berlin's streets. Thousands of flames moving like a river through the night. At a lit window above the crowd, Hitler watches. The city has been placed in his hands that morning. What happens next happens fast. Weeks pass. The famous El Dorado nightclub, the most well-known gay bar in Berlin, is shut down and plastered with Nazi posters. Gay newspapers are suppressed. Organizations that took decades to build are forced to dissolve overnight. May 1933. A Nazi student mob surrounds Magnus Hirschfeld's Institute for Sexual Science. They ransack the building. They carry the library into the streets. Books, research, records, evidence of an entire world of knowledge are thrown into public bonfires. Hirschfeld himself, he makes a decision. He will not return to Germany. He dies in exile in 1935, never seeing his country again. In just months, networks that took 30 years to build were completely destroyed. But the Nazis weren't done. They were just getting started. Here's something that complicated the Nazi narrative. One of the regime's most powerful men was openly gay. Ernst Röhm, chief of the SA, the Sturmabteilung, the brown-shirted paramilitary force that had helped Hitler rise to power. Röhm made no secret of his homosexuality. His enemies had already outed him in the press back in 1931. Hitler defended him, for a while anyway. Then came the summer of 1934, the purge known as the Night of the Long Knives. Röhm and other SA leaders were murdered. Political rivals eliminated. Power consolidated. And here's the critical part. Nazi propaganda blamed Röhm's homosexuality for the conspiracy. They used his sexuality to justify the killing. This removed the last obstacle to what was coming next. June 1935. The Nazi regime rewrites paragraph 175. The old law was vague. This new version is surgical in its precision. It doesn't just criminalize sex between men, it criminalizes almost any intimate contact. A kiss, a touch, affection expressed in a letter. The law is so broad that almost anything can be prosecuted under it. The maximum penalty jumps from 6 months to 10 years of hard labor in prison. This isn't random. This is systematic. This is architecture. But even stricter laws meant nothing without enforcement. And the Nazis were about to build the most efficient enforcement system the world had ever seen. 1936. Heinrich Himmler, head of the SS, establishes the Reich Central Office for the combating of homosexuality and abortion. It's a dedicated institution. Its sole purpose: find gay men and eliminate them. The Gestapo, Nazi secret police, and the criminal police called the Kripo work together. They raid bars. They compile lists. They wait. But the most effective tool isn't police work. It's denunciations. A neighbor notices something. A colleague hears a rumor. A family member suspects. They report. The police arrive. The interrogation begins. And once the interrogation starts, the network unravels one confession at a time. The numbers are staggering. Around 100,000 men are arrested under paragraph 175 during the Nazi years. That's roughly one arrest every 3 days for 12 straight years. About 53,000 of these men are convicted. Most serve fixed prison sentences and are eventually released, but the conviction goes on their record, permanently. The stigma never leaves. Late 1933. The Nazis introduce a new tool into law: forced castration. Officially, it's presented as voluntary. Men are told they can accept castration in exchange for early release. Many men agree, not because they want to, but because the alternative is continuing imprisonment in a Nazi prison. The choice is lose your body or lose your freedom, usually both. Friedrich-Paul von Großheim was one of them. Arrested in Lübeck in January 1937 as part of a mass sweep of 230 men. He survives 10 months in prison, gets released, gets rearrested, gets tortured. Finally, the Nazis release him on one condition: he must be castrated. Friedrich-Paul submits to the operation. His body is marked. His life is permanently altered. And he's considered one of the lucky ones because he survived. But prison wasn't the worst place a gay man could be sent. The concentration camps were something else entirely. Between 5,000 and 15,000 men are sent directly to concentration camps as homosexual offenders. They don't go through the prison system. They go straight to the camps. Each one receives the same mark, a pink triangle sewn into their uniform. It's not a badge of identification. It's a label, a target, a message to everyone around them. This man is less than human. And the moment they arrive, something becomes clear. The pink triangle prisoners are at the absolute bottom of a hierarchy designed to break them. Concentration camps operated on a brutal social system. Different prisoners wore different colored triangles. Political prisoners, criminals, Jews, Romani people, and the pink triangle prisoners, the gay men. According to survivor testimony, the pink triangle men were the lowest group in the entire camp, lower than everyone else. They were shunned even by other prisoners who feared being associated with them. Because in the camps, survival depends on networks. Small groups of men who protect each other, share food, watch for danger. The pink triangle men were cut off from those networks, deliberately isolated, deliberately made vulnerable. They were assigned to the hardest labor, and conditions inside the camps were designed to kill. Josef Kohout was arrested in 1939, at age 24. A Christmas card to his lover was intercepted. That was enough. He's sent to Sachsenhausen concentration camp, one of the most notorious camps in the Nazi system. What happens there is documented in his testimony. In winter, the men of his block are forced to sleep with their hands outside the blankets. In freezing cold, their hands exposed to air that drops below zero. If they're caught with their hands inside, guards wake them. They're doused with water, left standing outside in the cold until their bodies begin to fail. Many men get sick from this treatment. Frostbite turns to gangrene. Pneumonia develops. Most of them don't survive. Josef calls Sachsenhausen the Auschwitz for homosexuals. He wasn't exaggerating. The death rate in these camps tells the real story. The exact number of gay men who died in Nazi concentration camps is unknown. But according to historical records, approximately 60% of pink triangle prisoners didn't survive. 60%. Think about that number. 6 out of every 10 men marked with a pink triangle died in those camps. Some were worked to death, physical labor so extreme that bodies simply gave out. Others were shot, executed for minor infractions or simply at random, to maintain terror. And some became something else, test subjects. The Nazi regime didn't just want to imprison gay men, they wanted to cure them. And they were willing to use their bodies to try. Buchenwald concentration camp. A Danish SS doctor named Karl Vernet arrives with a mission. Himmler himself has given him permission. The mission: cure homosexuality. Vernet believes he can do it through a surgical procedure. He's going to implant capsules in gay prisoners. These capsules, he theorizes, will release testosterone and reprogram their sexual orientation. It's pseudoscience, wrapped in Nazi ideology. But Vernet has resources, he has authority, and he has prisoners who cannot refuse. The experiments begin, and they achieve exactly what you'd expect from torturing men's bodies and expecting to change their minds. Nothing. The experiments achieve nothing. The homosexual prisoners don't become heterosexual. They become traumatized. Their bodies are damaged. Some of them die from the procedures. Vernet keeps operating anyway, because stopping would mean admitting failure, and admitting failure would mean facing consequences. By 1942, the camps are conducting forced castrations on a massive scale. Camp commandants can now order it. No consent required. No pretense of voluntariness. It's biological destruction. It's mutilation. It's an attempt to erase sexuality itself. After the war, you'd think men like Vernet would face justice. You'd think the world would hold them accountable. But that's not what happened. Karl Vernet is never tried by the Allied forces. He's never prosecuted. He's never held accountable for the men he tortured in the name of science. Instead, he escapes. He flees to Argentina. He lives out his life in Buenos Aires. He dies there in 1965, never facing a court, never saying he's sorry, never acknowledging what he did. This isn't a footnote in the story. This is the story. Because Vernet's escape reveals something about what happened after 1945. The camps were liberated. The prisoners were freed. But liberation didn't mean justice. And for gay men, freedom never really came. The camps are liberated. Allied soldiers arrive. Prisoners walk free. The men with pink triangles are released, like everyone else. They're thin. They're damaged. They've survived things that should have killed them, and they're going home. They believe the nightmare is over. They believe they'll be able to rebuild. They've already endured the worst. Surely things will get better now. But when they get home, they discover something that catches them completely off guard. The law that sent them to the camps is still in effect. Paragraph 175 doesn't disappear in 1945. It stays on the books. In West Germany, it stays until 1969. In East Germany, it's removed in 1968. But in the country where most of these men lived, it remains law for another 20 years. Think about what that means. Gay men are liberated from Nazi camps. They're freed from concentration camps. But they're not free to be who they are, because the law still says they're criminals. Some men who were serving sentences when the camps were liberated are never actually released. They serve out their prison terms under the post-war government. They go from Nazi prisons to Allied prisons, with barely a gap in between. And if they thought the persecution ended with the Nazis, they were about to learn a brutal lesson about how systems survive even when regimes fall. In the post-war era, new arrests happen. New trials occur. Gay men are convicted under paragraph 175 in the years after the war, not during it. The machinery didn't stop. It just changed hands. In East Germany, homosexuality is decriminalized in 1968. In West Germany, it takes until 1969. But even then, the paragraph itself isn't removed. It's modified. It's weakened. But the legal framework remains in place. It takes until 1994, nearly 50 years after the war ended, for paragraph 175 to finally be removed from German law completely. But removing the law wasn't the same as acknowledging what had been done. In fact, the silence around gay persecution would last even longer than the law itself. After 1945, something strange happens. The world begins to tell itself a story about the Nazi period. A story about liberation, resistance, the triumph of good over evil, rebuilding. But the gay prisoners don't fit into that story. They don't fit into the narratives nations wanted to tell about themselves. So they're left out. Decades pass. Historians write about concentration camps. Museums are built. Memorials are constructed. But the pink triangles remain largely unmentioned. The story of gay men under Nazism becomes a blank space in historical memory. For 40 years, the men who survived the camps were basically invisible. And the men who didn't survive were forgotten. Survivors have to live with this. They've endured Nazi persecution. They've survived camps that killed 60% of their prisoners. They come home to find themselves still treated as criminals. And nobody talks about it. They can't discuss what happened to them in public. If they do, they risk rearrest. They risk being identified. They risk having their trauma used against them. So they stay silent. They hide their past. They live as if those years never happened. But the scars remain. The memories remain. The trauma compounds. It wasn't until the 1990s, nearly 50 years later, that Germany even officially recognized these men as victims of Nazi persecution. 1990s. Finally, the German state acknowledges that gay men were persecuted under Nazism. Finally, there's recognition. But recognition isn't the same as justice, because by then, many survivors have already died. Many have lived their entire post-war lives without acknowledgement, without apology, without being called victims. In 2002, Germany overturns the wartime convictions of gay men. More than 50 years after the war ended, the convictions are erased from the record. But the men who lived through that system, who served those sentences, who were called criminals by their own government, they don't get those years back. The pink triangle has become a symbol of resistance, a symbol of memory. It's been reclaimed by activists and survivors as a statement of defiance against erasure. But here's what's important to understand. That symbol came late. The reclaiming came after decades of silence. After generations of survivors had already died without being called victims. And there's something else that most people still don't know about what happened to these men after the war. How many survivors never told anyone what happened to them? How many took their trauma to their graves without ever speaking about it? How many died believing their suffering wasn't important enough to be remembered? The Nazi regime tried to erase gay men from history. It didn't succeed completely. We know some of their names: Joseph Kohout, Friedrich-Paul von Grossheim, Willem Arondeus, who was executed for helping Jews escape. But for every survivor whose name we know, there are hundreds whose names are lost, thousands whose stories were never recorded, millions of moments of human connection and resistance that disappeared without trace. The story of gay men under Nazi persecution isn't just a story about the Holocaust. It's a story about how societies forget, how systems of oppression outlive the regimes that created them, how silence can be more destructive than violence. And it's a story that asks us a question we haven't finished answering. What are we still forgetting right now?